You make things difficult for us, do you?
No, not really. I try to help. But once in a while I get lucky and do help.
Hello everyone. So welcome to a special edition of Cloud Simplified. We're here at the Redmond campus at the Executive Briefing Center, and I have some folks lined up to provide some insight into how we do things with exposing cloud services and capabilities to end users and business units here at Microsoft, which I personally feel are extremely applicable to customers such as yourself. So joined with me today is Robert from MSIT.
Hi,
welcome, Robert.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a bit about creating and establishing some security perimeters for services that you might have on premises. Traditionally, it's always desired to put big Chinese firewall around a great firewall around services that you might have employed on premises, and oftentimes we see customers wanting to repeat that in the cloud world. And Robert's going to talk about some of the challenges and trials and tribulations that we had here at Microsoft to go through that journey, and features that we use in Azure to be able to overcome some of those those situations and be able to make sure the assets we have in Azure is secure, and also that we balance security with being able to provide services to business units and internal employees. Yeah. So welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So give me a little background of kind of where we started and kind of what we did traditionally here at Microsoft.
Sure.
Which I think when you and I were chatting earlier very much aligns with how I see a lot of our customers doing things.
So historically at Microsoft, IT shop was generally a centralized shop. So we had static support, centralized support teams, centralized SQL support, networking teams, etc., security teams. Mm-hmm. And then we've undergone this digital transformation, and I know that's kind of a buzzword, but for IT it really was around moving to the cloud, moving to more of an agile development practice, and then moving to a DevOps culture. And those three things combined actually make your security, how you look at security and your security stance, something you need to review, right, from a customer standpoint. So most customers are used to, hiding behind that great firewall or that firewall, and then everything within the corporate network is considered safe.
So you have stateful packet inspection device, all this perimeter stuff and equipment and
kind of a castle. So if you think about technology, if you think about it from static fortifications were the big thing back in the Middle Ages, right? They were very secure inside the castles, until someone brought a cannon or airplanes were developed, right? And so those things don't typically apply. So when we talk about Azure and you move in these things to the cloud, the corporate network starts to lose its boundary, and so the valuable gold within the corporate network is actually the data. And so when you start putting your data on someone else's network and not within your own private IP or private corporate network, you're basically, you have to think about security differently. And so that firewall, that great wall, that impenetrable wall becomes less of a factor. So what really has to happen is you need to start thinking about identity as your major kind of a gate, so to speak, of how do you think about who can get access to what and what can they get access to.
I love that statement, because so many times I see customers talking about whitelisting ranges of IP addresses in Azure and wanting to whitelist public IP addresses that Azure services might actually potentially run on, that might be an IP address you're using today, but those addresses can change, and that becomes kind of a maintenance headache. And so moving to using identity as a means of establishing a boundary, I think is I don't want to use the word paradigm shift in a negative connotation, but it is a change in culture.
Yeah, it is. And we start thinking about, instead of putting some of these gates in place, we start thinking about guardrails and making sure that we can make sure the engineers can have the flexibility and the accountability to do the things that they need to do. But when you think about security, security is not just environment security. You got to think about your code. You got to think about how you're going to operate. You got to think about how you design your apps, and all these things come together to create a secure service, a secure application. If you miss in any one of those things, you actually are opening yourself up. You can have the most secure environment you want, but if I write bad code that has SQL injection or query string manipulation or whatever, cross-site scripting, I can bypass that secure environment. Same thing with good code. I could have great code, but if my environment isn't patched or whatever, right? So, I basically have a vulnerability.
And technically, I mean, your bad code situation with SQL injection, that could actually apply in kind of the old world, in having a castle that you have all these boundaries, and then you've got, an open hole to that with, potentially badly written code.
So what it really does is it starts to put a focus and from us, we roll this into the DevOps, which is focus of accountability down into the engineering teams to make sure that they're accountable for their security, which means they need to have the tools to be able to do that. And so when you talk about Azure, some of the tools that we think about are the Azure RBAC model. Actually, let's back up. Your subscription model, right? What does your subscription model look like? Do you separate by production and pre-production? What about resource groups within the subscription? Do you have one subscription and just separate by resource groups? Each one of those things could have a different Azure RBAC model, right? So a different role-based access control, right? And so I can start limiting things. And so in Azure, for example, I could say I have my backend in one RG, I have my middle tier in one RG, and I got my UI in one RG. 3 separate RGs. I can actually say, hey, my support engineer only gets access to the front end, or only gets access to the middle tier, not access to the back end.
Or where the data is housed, or whatever. So you can put more restrictive policies around where the golden nuggets are.
Right. So if you think about it, so from a security standpoint, it starts with your design, and now the Azure subscription model and RBAC comes into your design, where in the old world, the centralized IT was basically just corp-net free-for-all.
So what governance strategies have we employed around it? Because I've talked to customers who get not really confused, but are perplexed, especially particularly ones that are new to Azure. With subscriptions, they might go down the path of having a subscription per project or something. In which there's ramifications to kind of taking different paths. So what do we do here at Microsoft?
So for IT, we actually have a subscription by service. So a service would be like a tax service or a revenue reporting service or a wrapper. And then inside the subscription, we have resource groups, and those resource groups actually not only segregate components of the service, but also environments of the service. So a couple of things we try to do.
Dev, QA, test, production.
Yeah, well, we actually try to move away from those 4 static dev, QA, pre-prod, or UAD.
There's expense occurred with that.
Because there's optimization expense. So we really want to think about environments on demand, right? Using things like ARM templates, right? So we want to deploy ARM templates. There's a couple things I can do. I can enforce some standards about what those ARM templates are, and so how they're configured, how the resources are configured, back to that security question. The other thing is I can reduce my cost and efficiency and spin up on demand and destroy, right, when I'm done with it. And so it's pretty secure when it's destroyed. There's nothing there.
True.
So if you think about it that way.
And that's that right there is kind of describing some of the power that the cloud brings to the table. That getting out of the traditional mindset of having all these security appliances that might have throughput restrictions on that on the amount of bandwidth that can go in and out of it. We talked about holes that could be potentially opened up by poorly written applications that are deployed inside that castle. And then we also talked about the notion of the traditional having n number of deployments to be able to support development, testing and QA. That there's cost overhead in that, and that having the agility with capabilities in Azure with ARM templates, automation, Visual Studio Team System, a la DevOps, Azure DevOps now, to be able to automate rapidly provisioning those services when you need to do testing, and then tear it all down.
That's right. So that from an efficiency standpoint, I know we're not talking about efficiency, but just the ability to not have that large capital outlay does a lot of things for you. You can operate more efficiently. You can do experimentation that you used to never be able to do before, right? I don't have to go buy a gigantic bunch of machines to do an experiment. I can see if it works and then just destroy it. When we're talking about security, so we talked a little bit about the environment, building the environment securely and making sure like Azure subscription model RG, RBACs in your design, besides your normal threat modeling stuff. Well, then you think about the coding aspect of it, right? And so making sure that you have your authentication, your auth-in, your authorization mechanisms hammered out, making sure you use an SSL, example, encrypted transmission. And then you actually move into you can do all these things, and Visual Studio is a really good thing for doing that. But then you move into the operations piece, and right, so you're not secure if you can't monitor what's going on in your application, right? And so from an Azure standpoint, we use things like Azure Security Center to get those notifications around, hey, is there a potential liability here? Is the server not patched? Is something wrong?
So Security Center, you can establish policies around, having a VM has BitLocker enabled, and so so now you're giving the agility to functional business units or teams to actually build what they need when they need it, but having some controls over stuff that they deploy.
And so we actually deploy kind of like a federal, state, city level of governance for when it comes to security, right? And so think about it as the service team who's accountable for their particular service is accountable for not only the service health, the uptime, and what the performance SLAs for their particular service, but they're also responsible for the security stance. And so they have visibility to what that is. But that rolls up to a state level, an organizational level, and it rolls up to eventually to a Microsoft level where there's full visibility about what the security stance is. Right, including how many servers are patched, how many servers aren't patched, what vulnerabilities are people using SQL auth, are they using AAD auth, those type of things.
So with that layered cake approach, how do we have that centralized visibility? Like, so let's say I'm in finance and I have using your tax example, and I've got I'm responsible at that state level for that my little piece of the kingdom, and you establish some governance policies to be able to automate the monitoring of stuff I deploy there. But how do you have push up that visibility to that.
So we use OMS to basically, so big push is telemetry, building the telemetry within your applications and services so that you have visibility into things like service cells. We use OMS, we use Azure Security Center. You can come in at different levels and look at it. So that city level, we call the people that are running the service or the service actually the city level. Then there's a state level up there, which we call offering. So the offering may be finance, for example, or HR. And then the federal level is more of an organizational wide level like CSEO. And to be real honest, we use Azure natively as much as we can get, and then we build some custom dashboards, Power BI dashboards that say, hey, this is where we are from a federal level, so that people can look within their organizations, right, to see what they are. The other thing I want to make sure that we add into there is, so I don't know if you know, but we run 90% of Microsoft's IT into the cloud, and we're in the process of moving in the last 10. Only 26.
That's a massive percentage. Yeah, think about how large of an environment that is.
There was, I think in the beginning it was something like 60,000 VMs.
Holy cow.
And so now we're really only about 26% IaaS. And so if you think about how we're pushing the teams and how the teams are going is, look, it's one thing to actually stand up a VM on demand, et cetera. But
it's an easy thing to do.
It's easy. And people are really comfortable, and developers are really comfortable with it, until the accountability, security, and say patching has to come along with that, right? And so, oh no, I got to patch this VM. And it says, well, maybe I'll start using some PaaS services so I don't need to worry about that. And so we really have a preference of saying, hey, we want to use SaaS right out of the box if we can. We use PaaS next, and we fall back to IaaS. Now, there's still a lot of IaaS movement when we're trying to move legacy apps, but pretty soon, the debt of having to deal with VMs, the bare metal is...
I had a customer actually do that where they launched a product, an ISV, launched a product that they commercialized, and through the development process, the patching and making changes, it wasn't really that big of a deal. But then when the service is live, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got this stuff that I need to patch and maintain. How am I going to do that without maintaining my SLA that I've promised my customers? So there's other challenges that
it's a cultural shift, right? So there's no more throwing over the wall. So when you think about all these different transitions, right, that DevOps transition of taking the accountability on the team to not only run the service but test the service and develop the service, it's a huge opportunity for enabling evolution and innovation.
Sure.
But it's also it's about understanding how your end-to-end works, how that end-to-end service works, and improving the service, right? And so then you start seeing things like telemetry getting built in just because, hey, I want to know how my feature's being used because I'm responsible for that piece, or I might be the DRI, or what we call a directly responsible individual. It's the person that's on call with the, he may have a support, it may be his shift, his 2 weeks in the on-call support role, and it's like, hey, I'm going to build this thing so that I don't get woken up in the night. And so you can kind of get amazed how fast things get fixed when an engineer is directly involved versus involves second and third hand from these support teams from a centralized fashion.
Right, and that only kind of describes some of the feature capabilities we have in Azure for somebody to be able to build on top. Take something that like Azure Security Center and kind of build on top of that customized reporting, that sort of thing. So tell me a little bit about the guardrails you mentioned about, going back to that discussion about how customers want to replicate what they've done historically in the cloud, and like what sort of parameters do we put in place to try to
a couple of things. So we think about we used to think about, historically we thought about gates going through an SDL or security life cycle check. Someone that security would review the design, review everything there. But when you think about you're releasing new code on weekly sprints or bi-weekly sprints,
that slows you down. So it removes the agility.
Right, and to be real honest, that application that you reviewed 90 days ago or 120 days ago is no longer look like the same thing that you're reviewing today, right? Yeah. So what we think about is trying to enable the security checks in place. So, in our build, in our CI/CD pipeline, we try to think about things like, and that's guardrails. So you can build whatever you want, but I'm gonna add a couple of tasks to your build to make sure you
static code analysis.
Make sure I'm scanning for secrets, maybe a public endpoint that I don't need.
Okay.
And then.
I know I've been notified about repos that I put demos out that have storage account keys that for even though it's not really golden nuggets, it's
not very secure if you give them the key, right?
Yeah, it could be. So that's probably an example of some automated scanning and alerting.
So we build it back into there, and then if you think about Azure, where we're headed, so we don't have everything figured out, right? We're still in our evolution, in our transition.
So 60,000 VMs, and we're still in our evolution.
Well, because we always think we can get better.
Yeah,
right? We can get better at this.
Okay, that makes sense.
And we learn things, and Azure changes on a very frequent basis,
As
right?
Our customers well know.
So new functionality, new capabilities exist, and so we want to take advantage of those capabilities, not only for a cost perspective, but also a security perspective in this particular case. And so you think about things like Azure management groups and policies, for example. And so instead of doing the let me catch you after the fact you deploy.
That's a fairly new feature.
That's a new feature, right? And so instead of catching after the fact you deploy or in your deployment, you just can't deploy. Right? Those type of things. Right? Another benefit of using something like an ARM template and infrastructure on demand.
So in the management groups, just to kind of summarize that really quickly, is a way to kind of define policies for. You've always been able to do it at a subscription level or at a resource group level, but when you establish those, it's oftentimes you want to reuse those across multiple subscriptions or maintain.
You want to put an organizational standard. Maybe someone has a different organization.
Exactly. So it's a way to be able to kind of capture all of those and say, okay, in this subscription, this resource group is going to have this policy on it.
That's correct.
And when you make changes to that policy centrally, it'll impact whatever groups they have that assigned to.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So anything else that you think would be beneficial to kind of talk about? With respect to network security. Well, actually, now that I think about it, one thing that would be interesting to kind of click in a little bit more as the identity as the new
barrier.
So aside just from usernames and passwords, like what other things do we?
So a lot of things. So here, newer stuff that I would recommend people try to use is stuff like MSIs or managed service identity. So when you're hooking up applications, that way AD manages your secret for you. There isn't a secret there to manage, for example.
So you have an application deployed, like a website has a managed service identity that's the context context the website is running under, and if it needs to talk to a SQL database, it does it under that context as opposed to
a
username that I know.
And from a developer standpoint, hey, that's one less thing I have to worry about, right? Once I've got it set up, I don't have to worry about rotating that secret, for example.
So I don't have to worry about usernames or passwords. I do not have to worry about a developer who might see that in a config file, and now you've got a security risk. So,
correct. And then Azure Key Vault, for example, right? So when you do have a secret key that you need to manage, and using something like Azure Key Vault to actually store and manage access to that key. The other things we do from an operational standpoint is we use privileged identity management, which is basically just a way to temporarily elevate yourself if you need to do something in production or in any environment, really, and then you get dropped out or you can drop out, and so there's no persistent access from that identity.
So I see lots of customers that have, the regular user account, they have an admin user account, and that's kind of pacifies the security needs for auditing and that sort of thing, but you still have that individual that has full admin privileges across everything. And PIM,
but you can actually try to get away from that by basically saying, hey, I'm on call this way, and for the next 2 weeks, I'm eligible to be elevated to an owner of a subscription if I need to. Now, I'm not elevated at that point.
I have to request it.
I have to request
now it's audited.
It's audited. Everything you do is audited once you've been elevated, et cetera. And so, trying to get rid of persistent, administration and persistent rights, entitlements in general. Again, protecting that identity. Right. Is another feature we try to use. So,
So that's a great summary, because I mean, think about eliminating usernames and passwords and config files, protecting them in Key Vault if you need to, and then using something like privileged identity management to
do an elevation to where if you need access to it, right? And only at the time you need access, and then drop out, and so you don't have that persistence. So while you're sleeping, you never had access. Right. So even if your identity was compromised at that point, you still don't have access.
No, that makes sense. And then so thinking about going back to one of the very first things we talked about, like if you have an application here that needs to talk to a public cloud service like a SQL Azure. I mean, are you then employing those identity concepts to be able to protect, you have an application that might still be one of these 10% that's running on premises today. It needs to talk to something in the cloud. How are you?
So most organizations, we have standards around our authentication and authorization. And so one of the things that we talk about when we talk to developers around security in this DevOps model is making sure that we secure the end-to-end chain, right? So if I got a typical 3-tier application, the tiers shouldn't trust each other. Historically, people use service accounts or these God accounts that maybe we can get across everything. Well, what that really means is if I compromise one machine,
I've got
access
layers
to everything. So we try to make sure that we have authentication and authorization checks at every layer, right? So that's in general. That's how we talk about we talk about a few things, but we talk about securing every layer. We talk about reducing your identities, your entitlements. Not identities, entitlements. We talk about making sure you do proper threat models to understand code reviews, right? Code reviews we have to have 2 people review the code before we can deploy the code. So there's another set of eyes. So there's a lot of these things and processes that we put in place to make sure that we build security from the ground up rather than trying to come in either at the beginning stage and when we know things are going to change on a frequent basis, or come in at the end and say, hey, this isn't secure, but it's been running for 2 months, right?
Okay, no, that makes it. So we're not doing all the whitelisting on Azure public endpoints
But we do monitor endpoints, right? So we talk about, hey, why increase your surface area? If you don't need a VM, don't take your VM, right? Use a PaaS, use SaaS. All right, so that's one less thing you got to patch, for example.
Right? No, it makes sense.
Don't have public IP if you don't need it, right? Use VNets to segregate your
SQL Azure allows you to only restrict access from a private IP.
So you have all these tools that are basically in the hands of the engineers now that used to be managed by a central team, and created a lot of friction and trying to get anything really done at scale.
Well, thank you very much. I think that you've given a good depiction of what we've done to kind of protect our keys to the kingdom and golden nuggets of data in the cloud. And from my point of view, we have a massive IT infrastructure, and if we're able to do it employing these features of Azure,
that's kind of how we think about it.
Any customer out there can do it too.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
No problem.
Yeah.